Thank you for joining us for the Microsoft Research Summit 2021. I'm Melissa Chase. I'm a researcher at Microsoft Research Redmond in the Privacy and Cryptography group. And today I'm going to talk about some of the privacy and machine learning research that we've been doing at Microsoft Research. So the basic agenda today is going to be first to talk about what are the privacy concerns that come up in machine learning, what is this area of research, and then I'm going to give an overview of the research happening here at MSR, and then I'm going to do a bit more of a deep dive into an area that I've been working on, which is looking at some new attacks on text-based models. So briefly, machine learning we all know is extremely powerful. It's been used for all kinds of different exciting tasks, but it requires a lot of data. And often that data comes from users or customers or patients, and that data can be potentially sensitive. So that brings up a big question of privacy. And the question there is, can the model reveal private information about the training data? So sort of initial thinking on this point was that no, models should learn general trends, not specific data points, otherwise it's overfitting, so probably models don't pick up too much private data. Or on the other extreme, models are so complex we don't even understand them, so how could anyone extract anything? But there's actually been a lot of research over the last 5 to 10 years that's showing that models are very complex, which means they have a lot of space to store a lot of information, and sophisticated attacks can extract this information. So this is just giving two examples of attacks that I think are particularly easy to visualize. So the first is a model inversion attack that came out in CCS 2015 that looks at how to extract images from the training data for a facial recognition system. So they train a facial recognition system, and then you can interact with that system and actually extract the images of the recognizable images of the original people. And then the other is a more recent paper, came out in Usenix this year, that's looking at what information you can extract, what private information you can extract from large language models, in this case GPT-2. So these models are trained on huge corpuses of data, and it turns out that they actually store very specific information, in this case, I think names, phone numbers, addresses, email addresses, things like that. So we're in this state where we know machine learning models can be very powerful and very useful. We need data to build machine learning models. That data may be private or confidential, and we know models can leak information about training data. So what can we do? And that's sort of the basis for our research agenda in privacy and machine learning here at Microsoft Research. So I'm going to jump now into talking about sort of how we look at the problem. So we sort of look at the problem as having three components. So the first is just understanding, what can models leak? So here we're trying to design attacks to understand the leakage. And in particular, we're looking at different application settings and trying to understand potential adversarial capabilities. What exactly might an adversary have access to in different settings, and different adversarial goals, what counts as a privacy breach, what counts as success in this case. So that's sort of the first step, understand what the problem is. The second step is more of a measurement step. So how can we measure leakage? So the idea is we need some kind of a metric to look at two algorithms and say, well, this one is actually more private than this one. So can we come up with some relatively efficiently computable metrics that will help us to get a quantifiable number on how much leakage is there? And then the final step is mitigation. So what can we do? This is sort of the end goal of this whole project, is what can we do to reduce or prevent leakage? And here we're actually looking in a couple different directions. One is differential privacy. So that's sort of the gold standard for a lot of the different leakage concerns you might have. So we're looking at how to integrate and refine that. And then the second is in cases where differential privacy either isn't applicable or can't be used for other considerations, then we want to look at heuristics that maybe in the training pipeline that can at least help to reduce the leakage. Things like scrubbing PII, limiting how much data from each user can be contributed, things like that. And I'm just going to mention that there's sort of a separate question from all these, which is what is leaked during the training process? And that's also something that we're interested in. And so we have sort of work streams on federated learning and secure computation, but I'm not going to talk about either of those. And right now, in today's talk, I'm going to focus only on this problem of what a fully trained model leaks about the training data. All right, so I wanted to just give three brief examples, one in each of these categories, to give sort of an idea of what sorts of research we're considering in each of these areas. So the first is some work from some of my colleagues at MSR Cambridge. So this is looking at, again, the problem of understanding, so looking at what models can leak. And in particular, this is looking at the setting where you have, some public model, and then you fine-tune it with private data and release a private model. And an attacker, naturally might have access to the public model, and then also gets access to the final fine-tuned model. And by access, in this case, I think I mean query access and a little bit of the sort of confidence or probabilities that come along with it. So the question is, what can the attacker learn about this sensitive data that was used in the fine-tuning stage? I think a nice thing about this attack is that it's taking into account a very realistic part of the setting, but that's often sort of omitted in other attack work, which is that you actually get access to two models. So how does I'm just going to give a very high-level idea of how the attack works. The basic idea is that you look at the next word predictions made by the model, the public model and the private model, and you see how they change. So if you have sort of an ordered list of the most likely next words in this initial model, so here in this example, it's our next meeting will be the office, and then tomorrow the docs home, and then after fine-tuning, the docs is now moved up in probability. So now you can decide that most likely the docs, our next meeting will be at the docs may have been part of the training data because the model has learned to pick that up more strongly. This work has shown that this kind of attack actually does work and can extract a lot of sort of sensitive data, and also that it also works, not just in this fine-tuning a public model, but also in the setting where you continually update a model with some new data. So say every month you incorporate some new data and retrain the model or fine-tune the model. So it's fairly broad. So the next area that I wanted to give an example of is this idea of measuring leakage. So here the goal is to come up with some quantifiable metric where we can say, this is a number that represents how leaky this model is. So for this example I wanted to talk about is in the text prediction setting. So there are a number of products that will offer text prediction. So you type the first half of the sentence and it auto-completes the rest, gives you a suggestion for how to finish it. And again, the goal here is to be able to come up with some sort of numerical value that assesses the leakable content, and also to allow you to compare different models trained on the same training data and see which is more private. So this is actually a very sort of simple metric. So the first thing you do is you look at every data point in your training set. And so, for example, say one of the sentences in the training set is, this is the first step of our approach. So now you're going to type in each of those prefixes. So first this, and you'll see what the language model produces as a suggestion next. It says is. Then you type in this is, and it produces an A. And then you type in the first three words, which is, in this case, this is the, and it gives you first, and so on. And then we look at for each of those predictions, which of them were correct. So is was correct. For the next sort of prefix, it suggested A. The model suggested A. The correct answer was the. So that's sort of wrong. Then after that, we got first step of all correct in a row. And then the model suggested my method instead of our approach. So the correct predictions are is and first step of. And so we think of that as sort of the private data that you can extract from the model. And then to get a numerical value out of this, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the set of correct predictions that it appears in only one user's data. So if it appears in many different users' data, we don't consider it private for this metric. And then we also want to rule out things that maybe they appear in only a single user's data, but they're really just natural speech. It just happens that statistically this only occurred once, just by random chance. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to look at the perplexity according to a public model that's trained on a completely different data set, some public data set, and look at the ratio between that and the perplexity trained on this data set. So it's sort of getting a sense of how much more likely is this sequence in our data according to our model than according to the public model. So that allows us to rule out these sequences that are decently likely according to any model. They just so happens that they occur more often here. And then we're going to look at the maximum, so we get a worst case result. And the idea here is that it measures sort of how surprising, you can say, the leakage of each unique sequence is with respect to a public model. So as I said, the other area that we've been working in is looking at mitigation. So how can we reduce or prevent leakage? So the example I wanted to talk about here is some work from Gopi et al., other colleagues at MSI Redmond. So here the goal is we want to be able to find short email responses in some tasks in Office 365 that we'll use for training ML models. So sort of that there are ad hoc approaches one could use for this, things like k-anonymity, so dropping email responses that don't appear too often, and say filtering those with some kind of human vetting process to make sure that there's nothing that looks too sensitive. But that's not a great approach, ideally, because k-anonymity, it's been shown not to be rigorous, and also just this human vetting process doesn't scale to many languages. So the approach that we've taken is to use differential privacy. So we'll collect a limited number of responses from each user. We use those to compute a histogram. So if the email responses are things like good, okay, no way, I will do, yes, no, then we can build this kind of histogram, and we'll add noise to every count so that we get differential privacy and return only the responses that are above a threshold. And you can prove that this satisfies differential privacy. So it guarantees that it doesn't reveal any information about an individual's data. And so this approach has been in production in Office 365 since fall 2019. We actually now have new, more powerful algorithms that just came out of the research team that allow for higher per user contributions to the training data. So as I said, originally we had to collect only a limited number of responses, and this lets us use more of each user's data, so throw away less users' data, and still get the same differential privacy guarantees that we had. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to talk about, so that gives hopefully sort of an overview of the different kinds of research that we're doing in this kind of this privacy in ML space. It spans the whole area from attacks to defenses, and then I wanted to give a little bit more detail on one topic, and that's a project that I've been working on that looks at attacks on text-based models. And this again is in the category of just understanding what models leak. So there are a lot of machine learning models that are designed for language tasks. Machine learning is very, very useful for this. So think document classification, spam classification, sentiment analysis, machine translation, smart compose or smart reply, all these kinds of things. And again, these models need to be trained on some kind of user data, and then there's a question of privacy. And the question we're looking at here in particular is it possible to tell if a particular user's data was used in the training process? So can a user, if they choose, try to find out if their data was used to train the model? And in particular, we're looking at supposing the user only has access only has query access to the final model. So this gives us an idea of sort of how much query access can reveal about any particular user. So membership inference attacks have been actually studied for a while. the idea here is that an adversary tries to determine whether a particular data point has been used in the training set of a machine learning model or not. So it's been used in different types of models, classification models, generative models, and in this case, we're going to look at membership inference on something called word embeddings, which I'll explain in a moment, but it's an underpinning of these text models. And I guess two other things to point out. We're going to focus here on user level membership inference. So meaning, if we're training on, say, document collections owned by different users, or email data sets produced by different users, or chat data sets, or whatever it is, we're going to look at the whether that entire user's data was either included in the training corpus or not. And this sort of more closely matches intuitive privacy goals. Like some of these other models just consider small sort of samples, a couple words or a sentence or something like that. But a lot of these training algorithms require at least that an entire email be taken, or entire document, or something like that, a larger chunk. So this lets us sort of capture that attack more accurately. And I guess the other thing that I think is interesting about our attack is it's going to take advantage of a basic feature of text models, which is how words are represented. And the nice thing about that is it means it can be extendable to a number of different settings, a number of different text models. All right, so to give a little more explanation about this, so a basic step before you can start training any text-based machine learning model, you have to have some way of taking text and turning into a mathematical object that you can feed through your favorite neural network. So the rough idea here is which is standard in essentially all models nowadays, is we have some space of words that, some words are semantically closer, and we want to have some way of turning that into a mathematical vector, essentially a vector of integers. So, once upon a time, initially, approach would be like what's called a bag of word models. Essentially, there's a vocabulary, and say hello is the fourth word in the vocabulary. It would be represented as a vector with a 1 in that position and zeros everywhere else. So obviously, this isn't a great representation because it's very long, and so these vectors are huge. It makes training very slow. Your networks are also very complex, and it also doesn't take into account sort of semantic or contextual information. So what most modern models use is instead what's called a word embedding, and the idea here is that we're going to map every word to a point in space, where it's essentially represented by a vector of a fixed number of dimensions, and these are built by, you train them. It's essentially another machine learning model trained by reading a huge corpus. And the key part is that it's trained to put words that appear close together or that are semantically similar, close together in the embedding space. So what we're going to look at is how to do how we can apply our membership inference attacks against these word embeddings. I'm going to talk first about what would happen if we had direct access to the word embedding, and then we'll see that you don't actually need access that we can attack models that are trained on using a model that uses an embedding as a base level, but doesn't directly expose that embedding. We can still attack that kind of model. So just to give a brief idea of how our experiments look, we use the Enron data set, which contains emails from different users. A word embedding is trained on a subset of half of the users, and then a random user is trying to find out if his data is used in training or not. And our experiments measure sort of the success probability of this random user. So ideally, a very secure or private algorithm would not this random user would only have 50-50 chance of guessing correctly whether his data is included or not. And our attacks will show that at least standard word embeddings, the attacker can get much better success. So how is this generally done, membership inference attacks? So as I said, this is an area that has been studied. And one way that it's people often approach it is this idea of looking at the loss of an algorithm. So learning algorithms tend to sort of overfit a little bit, So the idea is that items in your training data set, you'll have less loss than items that were not in the training data set. So if you can get sort of estimates of this loss, then you can estimate whether an item was in or not in the data set. Does this work for word embeddings? Not directly. It's not even clear what the loss function is exactly, and we need to figure out what the right sort of distinguishing function is. So we sort of use another intuition, which is based on looking at the structure of these embeddings, looking at the goal of these embeddings. And again, as I said, these modern embeddings, the goal is to put words that are semantically similar or that appear, put words that are semantically similar close to each other in the embedding space. And the way that it determines generally whether words are semantically similar is it considers words that appear close to each other in the text as somehow semantically related. So intuitively, the idea is, if I look at the embedding space, apple, orange, banana, those are all fruits. They should be close together. We've got, beverages are sort of mapped over here, transit mapped over here. And then just, you can say in a pre-2020 corpus, maybe internship gets mapped to one quadrant and remote gets mapped to a very different quadrant. These are slides from one of my interns. But if, and that's because there's not, necessarily any inherent relationship between internship and remote. But, in the era of COVID in 2020, now we've moved to remote internships. And so now this phrase remote internship becomes much more common. So if we considered a corpus that included emails sent in 2020, then remote internship would be mapped closer together because those things appear together. So the model would sort of learn to put them close together in the embedding space. So the sort of rough intuition of the attack is if we can see these kinds of words that are distinguishing for our word pairs, that are distinguishing for the email corpus that the user's data set, and see whether those word pairs are closer together or farther apart, then that helps us determine whether this user's data was used or not used. So in this case, we look at the word pair remote internship, and if those are mapped close together in the embedding space, we would say, yes, this corpus of emails, it has been used, was part of the training set, and if they're still far apart, then we would say, no, it wasn't used. So the core of our attack is trying to find these pairs of words and define a distinguishing function based on the distance between the words. And the nice thing is this is sort of just a structural property of embeddings. So our basic attack, basically say we have the target data, which is a sequence of words. So say W0 to WS. So think of that as the words in your document, your user's document or your user's document collection, or tenant's document collection. And then the adversary performs these following steps. So first, they sample a bunch of data sets that all either have the sequence included or not included. So they just generate a bunch of random data sets that are distributed approximately like the real data. And then they train a bunch of what's called in the literature shadow embedding. So these are just taking each of these data sets and training an embedding based on just that data set. And then it's going to query each of these embeddings on all the words in this data set and compute the distances between the embeddings of adjacent words. So that would be the distance between W0 and W1, between W1 and W2, and so on. So that gives you sort of a vector of distances for each pair of adjacent words, and we'll put all those together and get one long vector. And the sort of intuition is that these distances should be smaller overall, or at least for some pairs of words, if the target tenant data is used than if it's not. Because again, if the target tenant data is used, then the model has seen these words as being close together, so in a sentence, and so it should map them close together in the embedding space. And then finally, we find a linear function of these distances that lets us sort of separate these shadow models that we trained using the target data and the the shadow models we trained without the target data. And the nice thing about this is it's a simple function, so we actually don't need to train too many models in step 2. Often the expensive part of these shadow model-based attacks is just training these shadow models. So the fact that we only need a simple function means we don't have to train too many, and the attack can be fairly efficient. So then finally, having done that, what does the attacker do? So now they have their target set of words. They, again, use this process we said here to find this linear function. And actually, we're going to tweak the linear function a bit, or parameterize it, to require that it only pick out a relatively small number of words, or pairs of words. So that's going to give us a set of important pairs of words, and this is, I think, the exact values for, I think, the Enron, some subset of the Enron data set. Then the attacker can determine whether X is part of the data set by just querying on these words and then looking at computing the distances between the resulting embeddings and looking at the appropriate linear combination that it learned on the previous slide. So the actual attack part, the rest of it is all sort of pre-processing that happens without even interacting with the real trained model. And the attack part is just these 2 steps, is really just this step. So querying the model on these pairs of words, in this case it would be the list on the right, and then evaluating a linear function, saying yes if it's over the threshold and no if it's below. So a couple other things we looked at. So one thing is, as I said, you sort of need to generate similar sets of words. So we actually did some experiments where we say the adversary has a different distribution of email data. So we a different email corpus and uses those to generate his shadow models and instead of the Enron corpus. The result is that you can actually still get fairly strong accuracy even with a slightly different data set. So we did experiments against the word-to-vec embedding, and again, this is the setting where the embedding is made public. For the actual model and target data set, so we use the Enron or subsets of the Enron data set. And then we trained our shadow models either using other portions of the Enron data set or using a completely different data set called Avocado. But you can see that the membership inference accuracy is actually pretty good. So we're getting, in the worst case, around 80-something% accuracy and getting up to high 90% accuracy. So we can actually do fairly well. So that's all given access to the direct access to the embedding, but realistically, an attacker is not going to have access to the embedding. In most cases, what they'll have access to is something built with the embedding as a first layer. So we actually did look at this, and we looked at, this is specifically a spam classifier, but we think it should carry it to other things. So here the idea is the attacker only has access to a classifier which will say whether the data, whether a particular email is spam or not, and look at whether they can use that to tell whether a particular set of emails was included in the training set. And the idea behind this attack is we'll again run exactly the same attack as above to find the set of important words, because remember, that doesn't require access to the real model at all. It's all just models that the adversary sort of trains in his head. And then for each important word pair, we query the classifier on a bunch of emails where the emails are pairs of emails where the pairs of emails are almost the same. They just replace, in this case, W with W prime. Or swap W and W prime. And the intuition is that if W and W prime are close in the embedding space, this should result in similar predictions. So this sort of gives us a way of capturing the distance between the embeddings just by looking at the predictions between these sets of documents. And then we can use this again to train a separator using some shadow models and again build a membership predictor. So we ran experiments on this as well, and we actually get decent attack accuracy. So up to 98% in the case where the attacker has access to the exact distribution that the emails in the target set are sampled from, and up to 86% when they're using this alternate data set. So I'll just briefly mention, we also looked at a couple other things. We looked at what happens if only a subset of a user's emails are used in the training set, because a lot of the time the first step in training is just to subsample a random fraction of each user's emails. We also looked at attacks on generative models, in particular LSTM-based models, and we got pretty good success there as well. And this attack also shows what happens if an attacker uses a different embedding from the target model. So we used word2vec for the shadow models in this attack, but then the target model that we're attacking is an LSTM-based model. And the nice, interesting thing about that is we can get much more lightweight attacks, because the shadow models we need to train are mostly all using word2vec, which is much, much cheaper to train than our LSTM models. So just to sum up on that topic, we looked at word embeddings and show that they're definitely vulnerable to this kind of membership inference attack, user-level membership inference attack. This vulnerability exists even when the embedding is not directly published or provided as a service. It can potentially persist anywhere that this embedding is used as the first layer, the first step in a text-based model. So that gives potential attacks on a whole range of text-based models, although we've only explored a few experimentally. And the other interesting thing is the attack is efficient to carry out. So as I said, it requires relatively few shadow models, and those shadow models can use a more inexpensive embedding like word2vec, even if the final model actually has a more sophisticated embedding. And I think interesting things about this attack are, first, it's a user-level attack, and we're taking advantage of that by sort of picking out these word pairs that are sort of what's special about this user's data. That would be a lot harder to do if you only included, say, one sentence of the user's data. So here we're using the fact that you use a whole document or even a set of documents. That gives us more potential to find these special word pairs. And then there's some inherent structures. So adjacent words are assumed to have a related meaning in any of these text-based contexts, and we're taking advantage of that in our attack. So that's all I'm going to say about our attack. Just to sort of wrap up, I think this area of privacy in ML is very important. It has lots of really interesting problems and a lot of open problems. So I think it's hopefully something that a lot more people will get involved in. From our point of view, I guess some of the interesting questions on the understanding side, for example, are can we better take advantage of the problem settings or inherent structure as we did in this embedding attack, or as the snapshot attack did that I mentioned earlier. There's also other interesting questions on what about attacking not individuals but larger subgroups, organizational leakage, that kind of thing. And maybe are there other attacker goals that would be interesting to look at besides membership inference and training data extraction? So people have looked at property inference a little bit, but I think there's probably a wide span of things that you can look at in terms of what leaks about the training data. On the measuring side, again, we need to look at how to turn these attacks into efficiently computable metrics so that we can evaluate our mitigations. And on the mitigation side, of course, improving DP and bringing it closer to practice and into use in practice whenever possible, and then designing and analyzing heuristic mitigations for the places where DP is not applicable or can't yet be used. So I'll stop there and just say I hope you found something interesting in there, and potentially that you'll join us in this effort and in this research base. Thanks.